She walked slowly between the stalls at the fair, as if she were carrying the world on her shoulders. The homemade sweets, which always sold quickly, seemed invisible this time. Clara, with her wrinkled floral apron and her eyes downcast, was no longer the smiling lady everyone knew. Something had broken inside her. A neighbor tried to start a conversation, another offered help, but she just shook her head, forcing an empty smile. What no one there knew was that 3 days earlier, Clara had received a call that would change her life. A cold demand, a cruel threat, and a choice made with a heavy heart. Have you ever felt ashamed to ask for help? Stay with me, because what is going to happen now? No one at that fair was prepared to see it. She paused for a few seconds in front of the flower stand, but couldn't choose a single flower. Her hands were shaking, and the memory of that voice on the phone still echoed like a cruel whisper. Either pay by Friday, or we lose everything. Clara pressed her fingers against the handle of the basket, trying to hold back her tears. This market, where she had always been welcomed, suddenly seemed hostile. It wasn't because of the people. It was because of the shame that was growing inside her, suffocating everything. She didn't tell anyone, not even her grandson. And that was what hurt the most. Jake had always been her pride and joy. She had raised him with sacrifice after her son's death. Since he was little, he had said he would protect the family like his grandfather had done in the war. But now, she was the one who needed protection. And she didn't have the courage to ask for it. It's hard to admit when we fall. When fear wins. When our hearts deceive us, even with the best intentions. And maybe, if you've ever experienced something similar, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If this story has touched a part of you, write here in the comments what you felt. Sometimes, just by sharing, the pain becomes lighter. And it can even help someone who's going through the same thing. And look, if this kind of story has meaning for you, if seeing truth, emotion, and overcoming makes you feel good, then leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps this mission alive, telling stories that deserve to be remembered and reaching those who need to hear that they are not alone. Clara continued walking, even more slowly. The noise of the fair seemed distant, as if the world were fading away around her. But in that silence, something was about to awaken, and it would change everything. It was a normal Tuesday, with a clear sky and a light wind blowing the kitchen curtains. Clara was in the backyard, arranging the plants in the flower bed, when she heard the landline phone ring. An old, half-forgotten sound that was still part of her routine. She wiped her hands on her apron, walked calmly through the house, and answered the phone as she always did, with that sweet, serene manner of someone who has seen the world change in every way. "Ms. Clara Reynolds," said the voice on the other end. Masculine, firm, almost official. Yes, it's her. Voilethin. This is the Tax Regularization Department. You have an outstanding debt relating to a tax withheld for years. We need to resolve this urgently. She frowned. She tried to recall some outstanding debt, some unpaid bill. But her mind was no longer the same as before, and the man's tone left no room for doubt. He continued. Unfortunately, if this amount is not paid by Friday, you run the risk of losing your property. But we can resolve this right now. Clara, who had already lost so much in her life, froze. The house where she lived with her husband, raised her son, helped her grandson take his first steps, threatened by an alleged debt? The ground seemed to disappear. She sat on the couch, clutching the phone tightly. I didn't know that. What do I need to do? He whispered. The answer was direct. A value. A code. A simple transfer procedure via app. The man said he was patient, helpful, even kind. He explained everything slowly, as if he really wanted to help. And Clara, overcome with anxiety, didn't question. She didn't suspect. She just did it. She typed the numbers, trembling, her heart racing. She confirmed. And when she hung up, the silence returned like a punch to the chest. She stood there, alone, staring at the wall. Then she picked up her husband's old photo frame, the one with the photo in his uniform, still smiling. and pressed it to her chest. She cried softly, not knowing if it was from loss, fear, or a sense of failure. She had always prided herself on being strong. She had raised her son alone. Then she had raised Jake. She had never asked anyone for anything. But that day, she gave in. And yet, she didn't tell anyone. Not to her neighbor, not to the girl at the pharmacy, and certainly not to Jake. How could she admit that she had been scammed? Of all people, she had always been suspicious, and she had lectured everyone about not trusting strangers. The shame was greater than the pain, but the worst was yet to come. That night, Clara barely slept. The sound of the clock on the wall seemed louder. The minutes took longer to pass. Her mind replayed the conversation, the amount, the details 1,000 times. He began to wonder if it really made sense. What if it wasn't real? What if... The next morning, she tried calling the number that had contacted her. Without success. The line was dead. Then she realized something was wrong, and it was like a knife going in for the second time. She went to the bank. She tried to confirm the transaction. The clerk said they couldn't trace the transaction the way it was made. She staggered home, her stomach in knots, her head spinning. Guilt was already consuming her completely. And yet, he remained silent. At the market that Saturday, Clara was unrecognizable. Her trembling hands had knocked over a jar of candy early in the morning. She apologized, picked up the pieces slowly, and pretended that everything was fine. But the look in her eyes was that of someone who had aged 20 years in just a few days. The neighbors noticed. Some asked questions, others just watched from afar. And the saddest thing of all is that, even surrounded by people, Clara was alone. At one point, as she was arranging the sweets on the table, she saw a couple with a baby. And for a second, she remembered little Jake running down that same fair aisle with a scraped knee and a huge smile. It was as if that memory was the last thing holding her back inside. She bit her lips to keep from crying in public. That afternoon, when he got home, he sat down on the couch, feeling weak. He opened his old cell phone and looked at Jake's name in the contacts. He ran his finger over it, thought about calling, but didn't. It was only the next day, when he himself called her on video, as he always did on Sundays, that she couldn't hide it. Jake noticed at the first, hello, the low tone, the gaze away from the camera, the silence between one sentence and the next. Grandma, what's going on? She tried to deny it. She smiled with wet eyes, but she couldn't. Her voice failed, and she told it. Quietly, embarrassed, almost apologizing with each sentence. Jake listened to it all in silence. When she finished, he didn't shout. He didn't question. He just said, "Give me the number and the message you received." Clara hesitated, but obeyed. And then Jake fell silent again. But his face was no longer the same. That look, Clara knew it. It was the same one he had when he last left on a mission. A look of focus, of decision. Without promising anything, he just said, "Grandma, leave this to me." On the phone screen, he seemed calm. But inside, it was already a personal mission. The grandson she had raised with so much effort was now returning to the battlefield. Only this time, the war was within the city itself, and it would all start with a crawl. If you got this far, comment below. It's not just money that is lost in a scam. Jake closed his laptop slowly, but his jaw remained clenched. The apartment was silent, except for the sound of a fan spinning overhead. He stared at the black screen, as if he were looking through it. The call with Clara had ended, but the words still echoed inside him. "I fell, Jake. I'm sorry," she said in a choked voice, holding back tears like someone holding a wall that was already cracking from the inside. He knew that tone all too well. The tone of someone who carries guilt. The tone of someone who feels small in a world that demands greatness. It was the same voice she had used when, years ago, she had apologized for not being able to buy him the new coat he wanted for the winter. He no longer remembered the coat, But that apology had never left his memory. Now this same woman, who had raised him alone, who had sold candy at the fair and mended buttons at night with tired eyes, was asking for forgiveness for being deceived. Jake felt a lump in his throat, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from fury. He got up from his chair slowly. He walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator without knowing what he wanted to get. It was automatic. He just needed a second to breathe. But it was no use. The memory of her voice, shaky and embarrassed, cut off any attempt at distraction. He opened his cell phone. He looked up the number she had given him. He analyzed the source. In seconds, he had accessed tools he used in security consulting. He wasn't just an ex-military man. He was an expert in tactical tracking. He now worked behind the scenes in the corporate world, but his field blood still pulsed in every decision. The data came quickly. A masked IP triangulated on a public network. But the trail wasn't that far away. Grandma's city. The market. A suspicious address. It was as if fate was teasing her. He saved everything, cross-referenced it, and sent it to a contact in the local police department, a former base colleague who was now working on the state investigation. He didn't ask for any favors. He just said, "I need it ready." Saturday, Central Market. That night, Jake didn't sleep. His eyes were no longer the same. As he reviewed the city map, point by point, he remembered his childhood. The days when Clara would wait for him with warm bread. The times when he would fall off his bike and she would say, "Get up, my soldier, get up." And now she was the one who needed to be lifted up. Only no one else knew that. No one saw what a strong woman she was. Only Jake. The next morning, he sent a curt email to the office. "Family emergency. Out indefinitely." He grabbed a light backpack. He didn't bring any weapons. He didn't need to. What he carried was more powerful. Information, preparation, and an overwhelming desire to see justice done. The flight left early. Jake spent the entire flight with his eyes closed, breathing deeply, calculating. He wasn't impulsive, never had been. But that kind of scam, he knew it well. People who take advantage of other people's weaknesses, who attack where no one expects it, emotionally, psychologically. It was more than a crime. It was cowardice. He arrived in the city and went straight to a discreet coffee shop near the fair. With headphones on and his laptop open, he began to observe the signals. He simulated the transfer that his grandmother had made. He analyzed the behavior of the system. In less than 2 hours, he tracked down an account associated with a shell company, a financial consultancy for retirees. The name on the screen made his stomach turn. This was no coincidence. The address was too close. The dates matched. The transactions were identical. Jake leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and took a deep breath. An old habit he had when he needed to think clearly. He knew he didn't have enough to arrest anyone yet, but he knew they would be back. Saturday. Always Saturday. That was when the victims were most vulnerable, with their bags full, their hearts open, and their pockets unguarded. He spent the next 2 days like a ghost, watching, mapping, listening in on conversations. One woman told me, without realizing it, that she had almost fallen for a similar scam. Another man said he had been approached by a consultant the week before. Jake just listened, took notes, connected dots. On Friday night, he went to his grandmother's house. She didn't know he was coming. When she opened the door, holding a tablecloth in her hands, she froze when she saw that familiar face at the gate. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice trailed off for a second. Jake smiled slightly and said, "It's not a visit. It's a mission." She laughed through her tears, the kind of laugh that only those who love can understand. But he didn't tell her the details. He just asked her to stay home the next day, and to trust him. Something she always did, by the way. On Saturday, Jake was there very early. He was wearing simple clothes, a dark cap, his cell phone in his pocket, and his eyes were alert. The market was full. There were smells of fruit, loud voices, hurried steps. But he wasn't there to buy anything. And then he saw it. Two men, dressed in discreet formal clothes, carrying briefcases and friendly faces. They stopped next to an elderly woman and began to talk. Jake approached slowly, as if he were just observing. But no one knew what he carried in his pocket. Screenshots, locations, copied messages. And on his chest, a name, Clara. Right in the comments. This should never happen to anyone. The morning sun slanted through the colorful tents of the market, casting dancing shadows over the hurried faces crossing the central aisle. The smell of roasting corn mingled with the sweet perfume of ripe fruit. Jake was there before the rush began, standing beside a vegetable truck, wearing a dark cap and a neutral expression. But behind his calm expression, every fiber of his body was on alert. He watched everything. Every gesture, every strange approach, every smile that seemed overly rehearsed. It didn't take long. Two well-dressed men, carrying thin briefcases and using the same rehearsed tone he had heard on the audio of his grandmother's call, appeared between the stalls. They looked like ordinary salesmen, but there was something about them that time on the job taught him to recognize. That strategic calm of someone who has already manipulated many stories. One of them stopped next to a lady holding a bag of flour. The other was already starting his speech. Jake approached as if he just wanted to see the oranges on sale. He pretended to compare prices, but he listened carefully to every word. The man said that there were tax irregularities, that the government was taking action, and that, luckily, he and his team were there to help. It was the same script, the same trap. Only now, Jake was ready. He slowly took his cell phone out of his pocket, already recording, and pressed a button that sent his location to his contact at the police station. He wasn't going to act too soon. But he wasn't going to wait for another Clara to be fooled either. The man with the briefcase kept talking, smiling with false empathy, offering free consultation, while Jake stood next to the tent, looking into his eyes as if watching an enemy disarm a bomb. Inside, he felt his stomach burn, a mixture of disgust and memory. Because it wasn't just a crime. It was personal. Clara wasn't just his grandmother. She was the last pillar of a difficult childhood. The woman who put food on the table, even when there wasn't much to put on it. Who sold candy with calloused hands, and still did his homework with him at night. That house they wanted to take away from her was the only place in the world where he still felt whole. The man offered the form. The lady hesitated. That was when Jake stepped forward, his cell phone in his hand, his tone calm but firm as steel. That paper there, you don't need to sign it. They're not who they say they are. The man's eyes widened. He tried to keep his smile, but Jake was direct. Clara Reynolds, 84 years old. They sent a message with this same code here, and showed the print on the screen. You fell for a scam, but I won't let this happen to anyone else. The booth fell silent for a second. The lady slowly lowered the form. The man tried to back away, tried to make an excuse, but Jake had already opened his briefcase and pulled out copies of fake contracts, cards identical to the ones Clara had received. The crowd around him began to gather. Whispers. Cell phones recording, eyes watching. And then he said something that stopped time. Gentlemen, this is a scam. And you have been identified by at least 5 victims in this area. The police are already on their way. The man tried to run, but Jake was ahead. With a quick, precise movement, he twisted the man's arm and pinned him to the ground, with his face pressed against the packed earth, and the audience around him in shock. The screams began. People filmed. Others applauded. A scream echoed in the distance. It's Clara's grandson! That boy of hers! The conman's partner fled between the tents. But Jake didn't follow, because at that moment he had already accomplished the most important part, showing that no one messes with the person he loves without consequences. The crowd parted as the police car arrived. The sound of sirens mixed with the restrained applause and the emotional tears of the lady who had almost signed the contract. Jake handed over all the documents, prints, recordings, and the complete report. The police chief, a woman with a hard expression and intelligent eyes, recognized Clara's name as soon as she saw the surname Reynolds. She said that the whole town knew that lady. As the officers led the criminal away in handcuffs, Jake took a deep breath. For the first time in days, he felt his body relax, but only for a moment. Because when he turned around, Clara was there. She had arrived at the fair early to sell her sweets, not knowing that she would find her grandson in the middle of a commotion. Standing there, with trembling hands and an expression somewhere between shock and relief, she watched the scene with teary eyes. Jake walked toward her slowly. He was sweaty, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes still intent. But when he got closer, everything softened. "How did you know?" she asked. He smiled slightly, lowering his cap. "Because no one messes with you, Grandma. Never again." She hugged him tightly, in the middle of the fair, with the audience around her still silent, as if they were witnessing something sacred. And there, in that tight, trembling hug, all the weight she carried on her shoulders seemed to fall away. The tears flowed without shame, without guilt. Because now she knew. She was not alone. Little by little, people began to approach. A lady handed out flowers. A boy took off his cap as a sign of respect. Even the owner of the pastel stand offered a snack, saying that it was on the house. Jake didn't say much. He never needed to. But that day, he stayed by his grandmother's side until the last candy was sold. Every gesture, every look, was a way of giving back what she had always given without asking for anything in return. Care, dignity, love. Write in the comments. You can't go wrong with someone you love. The confusion spread like wildfire among the stalls. The muffled cry of surprise from the lady who was about to sign the fake contract echoed through the fair's corridor, followed by a growing hubbub. People turned around. Others stopped walking. 1 or 2 people were already raising their cell phones, recording without knowing exactly what was happening. But Jake knew, and so did the man in front of him. The man, sweating beneath his starched collar, took a step back, trying to maintain his composure. But his mask had already slipped. His hand shook as he tried to close his briefcase, his eyes darting around in search of an escape route. His partner, further back, was already moving discreetly between the stalls, blending into the flow of shoppers. Jake didn't even look. His focus was fixed on the first one. The silence of the coup had been broken, and with it, something inside the people too. A merchant shouted, "It's a scam!" And suddenly, the crowd seemed to have woken up from a stupor. It was as if the hidden truth had finally gained a voice. Jake didn't need to shout. He just held out his cell phone, showing the messages, the receipts, the screenshots with the location, and cross-referenced data. The name of the fake company. The account number. Everything there, chewed up, documented, irrefutable. The con artist tried to take another step back, but Jake moved with precision. Within seconds, he had immobilized him with one clean move. Too fast for any reaction. It wasn't violent. It was firm, technical, surgical. Those watching didn't see aggression. They saw determination. The man fell to the ground sideways, still trying to protest, but his dignity had already drained away, along with the sweat. Jake knelt beside him, resting the weight of his arm on the criminal's shoulder. The crowd around him formed a circle, some in absolute silence. Others whispered names, memories, faces of old people who might have also been deceived. An old woman approached with teary eyes and a choked voice. "He tried to talk to me last week. He called me special lady. I almost believed him." Jake looked at her and just nodded. There was no anger in his eyes. There was memory. Each victim was a repetition of what his grandmother had suffered. And he knew all too well the silent pain of being ashamed of having trusted. The sound of the siren approached, cutting through the thick atmosphere in the air. The police car stopped a few meters away, making space between the stall holders, with their headlights still on. 2 police officers quickly got out, one of them already recognizing Jake from afar. "It's him, Donna Clara's grandson. We've been waiting." Jake stood up slowly and handed over all the documents, the printed report, the digital evidence. The con man, still on the ground, said nothing more. The other accomplice, who was trying to escape, was captured 2 streets later, trying to hide the papers inside a bag of oranges. Meanwhile, Clara, who had arrived minutes earlier carrying her basket of sweets, stood frozen a few meters away. She saw everything. She saw her grandson standing in front of the crowd, like a silent guard in the midst of the chaos. Her eyes filled with tears before she even fully understood what was happening. Jake, noticing his grandmother, walked towards her slowly. People made way for him. There was no rush at that moment. Time seemed to have stopped just for them. "You taught me to care for others. Now it was my turn," he said, his voice low, firm, but full of emotion. Clara didn't answer with words. She simply hugged him, her face hidden in his chest, as if time had gone back and he was still the boy she had rocked on difficult nights. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a silent recovery of everything she thought she had lost: her dignity, her strength, her protection. The entire fair watched, and no one said anything, because everyone there understood, even if without words, the weight of that moment. Sometime later, with the criminals taken away, the crowd still hadn't completely dispersed. A young man approached Jake and said, "Thank you. My aunt fell for that scam too, but she never told anyone." Jake just nodded. He knew that for every scam that was uncovered, dozens still hid behind shame and silence. He spent the rest of the morning with Clara, helping her arrange the sweets at the stand. People came, bought them, complimented them. But now it was different. Now she was seen not as a vulnerable lady, but as the strong woman who raised a man who had the courage to stand up to the system, in the middle of the street, among the people. During the afternoon, a local reporter showed up. She wanted to interview Clara. She declined with a gentle smile. She said she had talked enough for a lifetime. But she allowed a photo, and in that photo, she was standing next to Jake, holding the basket of sweets, and the folded newspaper with the headline, "Truth Revealed at the Fair, Scam Against Seniors Dismantled by Ex-Military Man." But what the newspaper didn't say was what Jake felt when he looked at her. Because deep down, that whole operation, the whole strategy, every step, every click, wasn't just about justice. It was about gratitude. About giving back to the woman who never let him down. The certainty that she would never be alone either. Write in the comments, "He who sows love reaps protection." The sun was beginning to set in the sky, dyeing the fair a soft gold that contrasted with the tension that still hung in the air. People walked more slowly, as if they respected the silence that had settled in after the end of the commotion. But for Clara, each step was still a mixture of relief and pain. She said nothing. She just held the handle of the basket tightly, as if the world could still slip from her hands at any moment. Jake was by her side, calm but attentive. He seemed at ease in that environment, but inside, he still carried the adrenaline of the confrontation. And more than that, the weight of what could not be erased, the humiliation his grandmother suffered, the fear she felt, and the time he lost away from her. Because, despite the victory that Saturday, there was a deeper truth which no one there saw, and which he himself was still learning to deal with. They walked together between the stalls, and something curious happened. The glances that had previously passed over Clara as if she were invisible, now stopped. There was respect in people's eyes, admiration even. Some whispered, others smiled fondly. A lady from the flower section handed her a small bouquet of lavender without saying a word. Clara tried to refuse, but the woman held her hands firmly, as if thanking her for something greater. Jake realized this. He realized it wasn't just about unmasking a criminal. It was about restoring a name, a story, and in Clara's case, an identity that had been damaged by neglect. He knew, because he'd seen it so many times during his military tour. In conflict zones, in refugee camps, in families torn apart by silent wars. The true impact of trauma was rarely seen in the moment. It came later, when the dust settled and the world moved on, leaving the survivors to rebuild what no one saw: dignity. Clara stopped in front of her own stand and looked at the sweets that still sat there, untouched. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to do. Jake noticed this. He picked up one of the small packages of peach jam and held it up. "How much does this one cost? Or do I get a discount because I'm Donna Clara's grandson?" She laughed softly. It was the first sincere laugh of the day. The people around her smiled too. A young man approached and bought 2. Then a woman ordered 3. And just like that, without needing to announce, without calling, without saying anything, the stand filled with people. It was as if each sweet there now carried a story, and as if everyone wanted to take a piece of it home. Meanwhile, the police chief who was coordinating the arrest approached. She had a rigid posture, but her gaze was respectful. She told Jake that the material he had provided was enough to open a robust investigation, and that the gang was already the target of other investigations. But no other complaint had such well-organized evidence, and none had been accompanied by such courage in broad daylight. "You could have left this to us, but I understand why you didn't." Jake just nodded. He knew this wasn't the police's fight, it was his. After that, the two walked to a bench near the central square. Clara sat down slowly, fixed her hair with her fingers, and looked around as if she were seeing the city with new eyes. Beside her, Jake seemed lighter, but not completely at peace. There was something about him that still needed to be said. Something he had been carrying since the beginning. You know, Grandma, when I was little, I thought courage was facing the enemy. But today I understand. True courage is not letting love be diminished by fear. You taught me that. And you didn't even realize it." Clara turned her face slowly. Her eyes were full, not of sadness, but of recognition. Because deep down, she always knew what she had done for him. She just didn't expect that one day he would say it out loud. A beautiful silence formed between the two. Those silences that say a lot without saying anything. And then, without warning, a group of children ran past. One of them, with a notebook in his hands, stopped, turned back and asked, "You're Donna Clara's grandson, right? The one who sells sweets?" Jake looked at her and replied, "Yes, I am. My grandmother said you're a hero, that you saved your grandmother like in the movies. Is that true?" Jake thought for a moment. Then he calmly replied, "No. I just gave her back what she always gave me." The girl smiled and ran after her friends, and it was at that moment that Clara let a silent tear fall, which slowly ran down to the tip of her chin and remained there, suspended, like an invisible medal. She said nothing, but inside her, something was healing. There were still wounds, of course. There were still painful memories. But now there was also a new sense of justice, and maybe even of peace. It's funny how certain moments in life seem small, but have a huge impact. Like a conversation at the market, a sweet treat, a hug on a park bench. Small details that, when looked at carefully, reveal everything that really matters. Care, truth, silent courage. Write in the comments. Small gestures carry big stories. The next morning, Clara woke to the familiar smell of coffee brewing slowly over a cotton cloth. The sound of the kettle, which had always been a gentle alarm in her routine, seemed different this time. Lighter, as if time had lifted the weight off her chest for a few hours. She walked to the kitchen, still in her flannel nightgown and her feet dragging. But there was something new in the way she touched her fingers to the counter. It was no longer fear, it was firmness. He opened the window, felt the cold air hit his face, and, for the first time since the blow, took a deep breath without choking on guilt. The garden was damp from the night's dew. The leaves trembled discreetly in the wind, as if all of nature was silently celebrating what had been restored. But there were still scars. She knew that. Clara was not a woman to ignore wounds. Even though her grandson had turned the tables with intelligence, courage, and precision, the emotional wound, the one that no one saw, still throbbed in the small corners of her heart. Because the shame that one feels when one is deceived does not go away with justice alone. It is a wound that needs time, acceptance, and small proofs that the world still has room for kindness. That's why, that week, she didn't lock herself in the house like she had imagined. On the contrary, she welcomed every visit with a genuine smile, sat on the sidewalk to chat with her neighbors, listened to compliments with teary eyes. She even received a handwritten letter from a woman who had also been scammed but had never had the courage to tell anyone. The letter ended with, "You made me feel less alone. Thank you for existing." Clara kept this letter inside the Bible she kept on her dresser, right on the page of Proverbs 31, where the virtuous woman is described as someone who smiles at the future. It was there that she understood the magnitude of the impact of what she had experienced, and she also understood that, even in the midst of pain, she had brought about transformation. Jake, on the other hand, had returned to his routine with a more attentive eye for detail. His days were still full of codes, reports, and demanding clients, but something had changed. Every time the notification of a call from his grandmother appeared on his cell phone, he answered with all his heart. And not just out of obligation. It was a real connection, presence. He started talking less about work and more about memories. He asked about the fair, the sweets, the children who passed by. And he always ended with, "I'm watching you, okay?" And it wasn't just a phrase. Before he returned, Jake installed external cameras, motion sensors, and a silent alarm. Not out of paranoia, but because for him, protecting was more than reacting. It was anticipating. That was why, the following Saturday, when Clara arrived at the fair and opened her stall, she found a small wooden sign on the table, with letters burned in it. "Here sells the woman who defeated a coup, with the help of a silent hero." She stared at it for long seconds. She ran her fingers carefully over the wood, as if touching something sacred. A lump rose in her throat. It wasn't vanity. It was memory. It was legacy. It was as if everything she was, everything she built, everything she suffered, was there, recorded in that simple phrase. People walked by, read, stopped. Some took pictures. Others simply bought more sweets than usual. But there was something different in the looks on their faces. It was as if, somehow, that little sign had made people see beyond the apron and the jars of jam. As if they could now see the story behind the table, the weight of the invisible battles, and the value of a woman who did not surrender to silence. At the end of the day, as Clara was packing up her things to leave, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, approached her with a hesitant look. She was carrying a baby in her arms, and her eyes were puffy. "Mrs. Clara, I was deceived too. I lost everything, but I read what they wrote about you in the newspaper, and I just wanted to say that knowing your story gave me the strength to tell my family. And they hugged me. I thought they would judge me." Clara didn't respond with advice. She just held the girl's hand, firm and gentle at the same time. "Shame be upon those who deceive my daughter. You were just too trusting. And that, deep down, is a form of purity." The girl smiled through her tears and left. Clara stood still for a while, looking at the sky. And it was at that moment that she understood that what she had experienced had not been just pain. It had been a sign, a calling, a way to transform her own pain into acceptance for others. Her journey was no longer about selling candy. It was about reminding people that dignity can be hurt, but never destroyed. That justice can be born from silence. And that even the smallest gesture can become a beacon of light for someone living in the darkness of fear. If you've made it this far, it's because this story also spoke to some part of you. Maybe it reminded you of someone. Maybe it stirred a memory that was stored inside you. And if that happened, it's because what we're building here together goes beyond a video. It's about seeing the value that exists in every detail of real life. So, If this type of content makes sense to you, if it touches you, teaches you, or simply makes you think, subscribe to our channel. Because that's what we deliver. Stories that deserve to be told. With truth, emotion, and purpose. And tell me in the comments if you made it to the end with us. Right, I would walk with Clara too. Just so I know you were here from start to finish. Oh, and if this video touched you in any way, please leave a like. Not because of the number, but because of the connection we created. This helps this content reach further, to those who also need to hear it. There is a video here that continues along the same lines of emotion and new beginnings. Click and come with me. Because this journey is not over yet.